Hola y bienvenido. Hola y bienvenido? Hello and welcome to Auspol Explained. I'm David, your curly-haired host, and I'm here to explain how Australia's political system works to you. While paying attention to what I have to say is optional, voting in Australia is not. In Australia, you are both legally required to enrol to vote, then also vote in federal and state or territory elections. Local government elections, however, are compulsory in some states while optional in others. However, in most other countries, voting is optional. You're not required to do it even if you can. So let's talk about that. Welcome to part 3 of my series of comparing Australia's electoral system to other countries. In the previous 2 episodes, I compared preferential voting with first past the post, and also why proportional representation provides better political diversity in representation. In this episode, obviously, I'm going to be comparing the arguments for compulsory voting and voluntary voting. Of course, I'm not going to tell you what you should think. If you like compulsory voting or you dislike it, well, that's up to you. I'm just going to present a few arguments and, well, you can feel free to have a good old, robust, but polite conversation in the comments section. So let's start with a little bit of history as to why Australia made voting compulsory. It revolves around this basic fundamental element where naturally, if you make voting optional, turnout is likely to be lower. That is the core motivation for compulsory voting. Before compulsory voting was introduced in Australia, the highest turnout for a federal election was about 78%, but usually it was much lower. The second ever federal election had such low turnout that it wasn't even 47% of eligible people who voted. For the Senate, this presents an obvious existential question about the legitimacy of a government. How could it possibly believe that it has a mandate if not even half the public voted at all, let alone for them? When Queensland introduced compulsory voting in 1915, its state elections saw a larger turnout than the national average. So it was adopted federally a decade later in 1925 and eventually is in every state and territory. Since compulsory voting was introduced, turnout has been over 90% for almost every single election. Australia now has one of the highest voter turnouts in the world. But what are the pros and cons? Like almost anything, there are many arguments and counter-arguments for it. Argument number 1, uninformed voters. An obvious con is that if everyone is required to vote, then that forces a bunch of uninformed and disinterested people to then go and vote. It guarantees that a percentage of those votes will be cast by people ignorant of a candidate's policies. Why should people vote if they don't understand the impact of their decision? But also, that's true of optional voting too. Every election, people will voluntarily and happily vote without doing any research. The only way to make sure that every vote is cast by someone who has educated themselves ahead of time is to include some kind of test to ensure that only informed people vote, which opens up so many more problems that are arguably far worse for democracy. Think about it, right? Like, who gets to decide what counts as an informed vote? Who gets to be deserving of participating and who doesn't? What kind of metrics are we judging people by? You can imagine how such a barrier can be misused by those in power and worsen an electoral system, not improve it. Ideally, really, we should just be letting people vote because people should be allowed to vote. The basic counter-argument, though, against the idea that voters will be uninformed is that if something is required of you, then it encourages you to learn about it. Compulsory voting creates an impetus on the voter to understand that their vote is important and should consider it in advance. If you didn't need to vote, then what's the incentive to become informed about a thing that you won't do? Like, no one learns to drive, in theory, while never planning to ever drive. Of course, that idea relies on the individual, and so it encourages some people, but doesn't encourage others. Argument number 2. Impact on representation. Proponents of compulsory voting argue it has a positive impact on representation and encourages politicians to develop policy that benefits a broader range of people. When more people vote, politicians need to make policies that have broad appeal because otherwise they risk losing a demographic that would vote for someone else. But if a demographic is less likely to vote or doesn't vote, then no party or candidate is incentivized to make policies for them because a loss of their support doesn't benefit their competition. It's just not part of the equation. Naturally, the incentive, therefore, is to focus on those who are more likely to vote and win them over, which can then create a narrower band of the public whose interests are being considered. When compulsory voting was introduced in Australia, that meant more elderly people were voting, and politicians responded by increasing the age pension and reducing poverty for retirees. However, in countries where voting is optional, people with lower education and lower income earners are less likely to vote, meaning that governments are less likely to be representative of those people, but instead more influenced by wealthier elites. The benefit of voting and how it encourages better policy for different demographics is evident in how historically disenfranchised groups like women and Indigenous people fought so hard to get that right to vote. They saw how it gave other people agency to reward or punish candidates at the polls, depending on how well their policies served them, and so therefore fought to have those same rights. And we have seen a tangible improvement in policy for different demographics as a result of more people being able to vote. At its worst, optional voting can potentially encourage polarization, as politicians don't need to appeal to a broad amount of voters, but can instead rely on populist tactics to motivate a select group. In a close race where voter turnout isn't guaranteed and the more fringe elements of their voter base threaten to not vote, then a candidate may need to appeal to them. If this repeats, then you can gradually get more extreme candidates that don't see a need to make policies beneficial to everyone, but rely on divisive politics and erode democracy. If politicians focus more on the fringe elements of the political spectrum, then they can get more normalized and polarize the society. Consistent and reliable high voting turnout, however, which compulsory voting encourages, effectively creates an averaging effect, reducing the chances of radical politics and making polarization less likely. That's not to say that compulsory voting is the only safeguard for that, but proponents argue that it discourages polarization. Argument number 3, financial benefit for smaller groups. If, like, voter turnout is somewhat reliable, then well, a political party or candidate does not need to spend their resources on getting people to the polls to begin with. They can focus more of their resources on messaging, on trying to convince voters that their policies are better than the other, instead of just like, hey, can you just actually show up at all? Argument number 4, access to voting. Elections and laws are not one-way streets. While the main critique of compulsory voting is that it compels the individual, it's also important to note that it compels the government as well. For you to abide by the law, it must be enforced, and so if you are required to vote, then the government is required to provide you access to vote. Electoral commissions in Australia go to great lengths to ensure people can vote, with things like postal voting, early voting, overseas voting at embassies, which I did once on my honeymoon, mobile polling teams that visit residential care facilities, remote areas, homeless shelters and prisons, and a range of accessibility options like telephone voting for people who are blind or have low vision. Voting information is also translated into dozens of languages, both foreign and Indigenous. Apologies for bringing up an extreme example, but we could compare this with less democratic countries like the US, where voter suppression of people of color and people in low-income areas is a deliberate and targeted action of many governments. There are a lot of laws that restrict access to voting in the US, like laws that require a physical street address to enroll to vote, which discriminate against groups that are more likely to have PO box addresses, like Native Americans living on reservations. Voter roll purges are done in areas that disproportionately impact ethnic communities. Many states have reduced the amount of polling places, specifically in neighborhoods with higher Black, Hispanic, and Native American communities, which then imposes challenges both to people's time and their finances to travel far distances, which may be impractical or impossible for people who are living paycheck to paycheck and can't take the day off, because Tuesday is the day that the US holds its elections, which is incredibly inconvenient for working class people. That is, of course, assuming they have access to a car to travel the far distances at all, which again discriminates against low-income earners and even if they got there, well, because there are so few polling places, queue lines can be incredibly long, which means that this really is a large time that you have to dedicate for a single action, and it's incredibly discouraging. This is a well-documented issue with the US electoral system. There was once a guardrail where jurisdictions in the US with a history of racial discrimination in voting needed to obtain federal approval for new voting policies. That part of the Voting Rights Act was overturned by the Supreme Court in 2013. In the decade that followed, states added nearly 100 new restrictive voting laws, with many of them being very obviously racially targeted in their effect, which led to a widening gap in voter turnout between white voters and voters of colour. A number of those laws have been struck down by courts for being racially discriminatory. What? The US has racially discriminatory policies? That's in part because of the culture and history of the US. You can't expect much from a country that constitutionally enshrined slavery into its system of government as a legal punishment, and now as a result has one of the highest amounts of slaves in the entire world. But the point is, well, you can see how compulsory voting creates barriers on the government's ability to restrict access. It ensures that voting is an equitable exercise that everyone has access to, regardless of their background, not an exclusive right for a privileged group to exercise. Of course, you could create other ways of fostering or requiring the government to provide access to voting, but compulsory voting is one of those ways that creates an environment where access is provided. Argument number 5. Civil liberties. It's time we come to our biggest criticism of compulsory voting, and that is, if it's a requirement, you don't have the freedom to not do it. Opponents argue it's therefore impeding a person's civil liberties. Voting is a right, but what about the right not to do it? What if you don't want to vote? Of course, the obvious counter-argument there is that's how laws work. You have to obey them even if you don't like them. It's not like most people would argue that having a speed limit is totalitarian just because you have to obey it even if you're running late, though some people could argue that the speed limit could be higher, or some people could argue that it could be lower. Some proponents of compulsory voting point out that voting is a civic duty, like paying taxes so that you and those around you can have the benefits of public services like roads, schools, hospitals, libraries, etc. It's part of the fundamental social contract of having the benefits of the state. You still have to pay taxes even if you're not personally enthusiastic about every way that they are spent. Naturally though, you don't need to agree with all the laws. In fact, disagreement is a natural and healthy part of democracy. It fuels discussions about whether or not something should change or if we should preserve something as it is. If you think that you shouldn't be required to do something by law, then you have every right to criticize the law and call for it to change. Like, yeah, I mentioned that you need to pay taxes, but you can vote in a different government that'll eliminate or reduce some of those taxes. If you think voting shouldn't be compulsory, then find candidates that support that change, or contact members to encourage them to consider it. Of course, you'd have to vote for that candidate for them to be successful, but that's not being ironic. I don't want anyone to criticize someone who does that. It's not like a gotcha moment. If they're choosing to vote for someone who wants to get rid of compulsory voting, that's in line with their values and they're expressing them exactly as they want to. Then potentially, if enough people campaign for it, then voting would become optional, and you could argue that choice gives people greater civil liberty. But even in that scenario where someone's fighting for the right not to vote, it brings up an important point about how what civil liberties you have, what personal freedoms you do or don't enjoy, are still fundamentally reliant on how you vote. The first and fundamental step in a representative democracy is for us to collectively decide who we want to be making the laws for us, for you, your friends, your family, community, and entire country. Who we vote in gets to decide what restrictions and regulations there are, and we get to decide if those are beneficial and protect us, or if they're obstacles and inconveniences. And then at the next election, we get to vote in new people who can change those laws for the better. Whatever imposition you feel about being compelled to vote, you must admit that it takes only a brief moment out of your life every few years, but a bad government that erodes other civil liberties will have a far greater impact on your everyday life. Voting is incredibly powerful and effective at holding our elected representatives to account, because it's the thing that allows them to be elected representatives to begin with and can then fire them from that position and remove their power. So even if the law doesn't compel you, it's still your personal and social obligation to vote to ensure your civil liberties are improved, or at the very least preserved. Voting is a direct way to have input on decisions that impact your quality of life, your rights, your privileges, and the benefits for your entire family and everyone you know. I've seen an argument thrown around a lot on the internet that if you don't vote, you don't get to complain about what the government does. I don't agree with that. If you don't vote, you still have the right to input and democratic expression, because it doesn't end at any point in between elections for anyone. Voting is not like a test where you need to pass it to gain access to all your other democratic rights. That's just ridiculous. But voting is clearly where that input begins and is a very vital part of that step. We all get to choose collectively who represents us, who are making those decisions on our behalf, and from there we can decide if that is working how we want it to, or if we should protest, petition, contact members of parliament and tell them to make different decisions. Then we get to vote again and continuously shape our democratic institutions and the laws around us. Yes, it's important to judge a candidate based off the merit of what they promised during an election campaign, but you should also try and judge members based off how you feel they will respond to and listen to feedback during their term. We don't know what kind of new policies they'll have to develop and decide on halfway through a term, but do we think that they're likely to respond well if the public gets upset, or do we think they're likely to ignore them? That's an important thing to consider when you cast your vote, because that then has a flow-on effect as to how effective all the other forms of democratic expression are in shaping what laws there are. Some people are going to do a better job at listening if people protest, and some people aren't. So, while protest is still important, you can see how voting is the thing that decides how effective things like protests are likely to be. So for everyone's benefit, not just your own, consider that when you go to vote. So in conclusion, is compulsory voting a good or a bad thing? Well, it's important to note that compulsory voting is not inherently within itself a thing that has merit. It is a means to an end, and that end goal is higher voter turnout. You may have noticed, however, that a lot of the arguments that put forward for compulsory voting rely on the positives achieved when more people vote. Compulsory voting is just one of those ways of achieving those positives. Things like better policy, representation, and transparency happen when more people pay attention and vote. Like I've said throughout this, voting is a way to hold governments to account, and the more people who participate in elections, the more it pressures candidates to develop better ideas with broad appeal and follow through with those promises. However, an apathetic population that only votes sometimes means that governments are more likely to do things that aren't for the benefit of everyone, because either they don't have the input of as many people as possible, or they know that they won't be held to account by the electorate. You may like compulsory voting or dislike it. Maybe you think it's great and maybe you want to get rid of it. That's up to you. Like I pointed out, you're allowed to campaign either way. You're allowed to be indifferent to this. But the takeaway I want you to have is that voting is actually important, that it benefits you, and you should do it regardless if the law requires you to or not, because it actually is a good idea. Thankfully in Australia, there are dozens of political parties and independents that cover a vast range of the political spectrum. If you do some research ahead of time, I'm confident you'll find someone who at least approximately aligns with your values. You do actually have quite a lot of choice, unlike places like the US. Unless, of course, you're an anarchist and you find that the whole idea of the existence of the state is actually antithetical to your ideological beliefs, in which case, yeah, I understand that and why you wouldn't want to vote, because, that's a consistent worldview. If you are the kind of person who goes oh, there's no good candidates because they're all the same. No, they're not. Come on. Snarky cynicism is out. actually caring and having input in the decision-making process that affects your everyday life and everyone you've ever known is in. So if you are Australian and you haven't enrolled to vote already, go to aec.gov.au/enroll to do that, and also update your details if you've moved or changed name. Remember, the Electoral Commission is your friend. So exercise your democratic right to vote and have your say. And that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this comparative series. Comment down below what you would like to learn about next, or how much money you have in your wallet right now. Do you still carry physical cash? I do, because I collect coins. Speaking of money, thank you so much to my supporters on Patreon who give me a little bit of money and get to see episodes like this early, as well as a little bit of bonus content. Thank you so much. Anyway, I'll see you next time.